Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now continue with our second session. The title is Evolution on Civil-Military Cooperation, Adapting to New Security Realities. I am therefore glad to invite our moderator for this session, Ms. Cynthia, on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speakers for the second session, Yang Berbahagia General Tan Sri Dato Sri Haji Affendi bin Buang, RMAF, Chief of Defence Force Malaysia. His Excellency General Rudzani Maphwanya, Chief of South African National Defence Force. And Yang Berbahagia Professor Dato Dr. Zakaria Haji Ahmad, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research, Health University. And now I hand over this session to our moderator, Ms. Cynthia. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Major Mira. Thanks for coming back to the hall. It's great to still see a strong crowd, especially after lunch, no less. They usually tend to dwindle. So it's great to have you back here in this ballroom. The topic for this session, as Major mentioned earlier, is the evolution of civil-military cooperation. And I think never before in recent memory, the role of armed forces has been more profound in civil society than in the last 2 years. Our soldiers step right up to the front line with our doctors, our nurses, our police officers during the pandemic. So thank you very much. There is a growing recognition of the role of military in non-traditional security threats as well as national emergencies. Now, having said that, at present, there is a lack of universal standard to differentiate military and civilian roles when it comes to civil-military cooperation. So we want to discuss how this cooperation can be increased in a way that complements the greater aspirations of society while accounting for emerging and evolving security realities. I'd like to introduce my panelists here. This man next to me needs not much introduction. Yang Berbahagia General Tan Sri Dato Sri Haji Affendi Buang, Malaysia's Chief of Defence Force. General Tan Sri started his military career with the Royal Malaysian Air Force in 1980 after the completion of his studies at the Royal Military College. Upon being commissioned as a second lieutenant and awarded his flying wings in 1982, General Tan Sri's career as a fighter pilot took off with more than 2,000 hours of flying experience in the MB-339A, the A4PTM Skyhawk, and MiG-29 Fulcrum, which I may add sounds foreign to me, but very, very cool. He holds a Master's of Arts in Strategic Studies from Deakin University, Australia, and is also an alumnus of the Royal College of Defence Studies, United Kingdom. In recognition of his outstanding bravery during the communist insurgency, General Tan Sri was bestowed the Air Force Medal among a long, long list of notable awards. Welcome, Tan Sri, and we are very excited to have you here. Next to Tan Sri is General Rudzani Maphwanya, the Chief of South African National Defence Force. General Maphwanya has a long career and held various positions in the Defence Force since 1994. He was Chief of Joint Operations prior to his current appointment. The General has extensive experience in military, combat, training on the African continent. Academic-wise, he had a background in commerce and went to complete his postgraduate studies in security management in 2012 and obtained a Master of Management degree at the University of Waters Rand Johannesburg. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, General. Welcome, General, and it's great to have you here in Malaysia. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, we are joined by Professor Dato Zakaria Ahmad, Vice Chancellor for Research at Help University in Kuala Lumpur. Concurrently, Professor Zakaria is also the Distinguished Fellow of the Malaysian Armed Forces Defence College, Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Affairs, IDFR, Institute of Public Security of Malaysia, and Malaysian Institute of Defence and Security, MIDAS, and they are all very, very important defence institutions in Malaysia. Professor has a long academic credentials. I shall name a few. He received his Bachelor of Social Sciences from the University of Singapore in 1970 and went to pursue his PhD in Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1977. Professor has taught in many, many prestigious universities, to name a few: University of Malaya, our national university, the National University of Singapore, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and University of Ohio. And now he's with Help University in Kuala Lumpur. So ladies and gentlemen, these are our distinguished speakers. Allow me again just to explain the flow if you did not join us earlier. Each panelist will be allocated 15 minutes to speak. A single bell will ring at the 12th minute for the panelists to wrap up, and a double bell will ring once 15 minutes is up. The floor will then be open for Q&A after all the panelists have delivered their presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Yang Berbahagia, General Tan Sri Dato Sri Haji Affendi Buang for his presentation. Over to you, Tan Sri.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Eminent panelists of this highly anticipated subject, the esteemed moderator, Ms. Cynthia Ng, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and very good afternoon to all. Praise be to the Almighty, by whose grace and blessing that allow us to gather this morning to deliberate on an issue of vital concern, that is evolution of civil-military cooperation, adapting to new security realities. I am certain that the eminent panelists would afford invaluable insight of this issue. The problem statement for this subject most appropriately stated that there is no universal standard to differentiate military and civilian role in the governance of a country. That having said, the new security challenges have compelled a relook to synchronize civil-military cooperation, especially applied beyond our shores and in multinational operation. CIMIC has been a key factor in the Malaysian Armed Forces since the first emergency, in 1948 until 1960. Needless to say, since then, the global and regional geostrategic landscape has shifted many a time with much water passing under its bridge. The advent of traditional and non-traditional security challenges have compelled the formulation of whole of government and whole of society architecture. In light of this, CIMIC has become more challenging and complex. The CIMIC framework was first introduced to counter insurgency in the 1950 under the Bridge Plan. It functioned on a multi-tiered at federal, state, and district level to oversee both security and development. All the committee were represented by members of the civil government, military, and police. This structure remains to this day with an extended spectrum of challenges and greater risks. In this sense, the national security challenges in Malaysia are being managed by the National Security Council. It provides coordination to government agencies and NGOs in a whole of government and whole of society architecture. For CIMIC, the Malaysian Armed Forces gained its baptism of fire during the first emergency. To contain insurgency, the National Security Council introduced the KESBAN, which is Keselamatan and Pembangunan, or Security and Development, which resulted in the conclusion of the emergency on 2nd December 1989. In fact, the Malaysian Armed Forces together with the Royal Malaysian Police were the backbone of the Malaysian fight against communist insurgency. As the post-second emergency security threat diverged, so did the modus operandi of the Malaysian Armed Forces, expanded in assisting the civil authorities. Whilst the Malaysian Armed Forces was developing its primary task, namely to defend the country against external threat, due consideration was also placed to perform its secondary role. By the beginning of the 21st century, the non-traditional security challenges faced by the country included counterterrorism and extremism, transborder crimes, piracy and high-sea robbery, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, human trafficking, smuggling and cybercrime. Over and above that, the Malaysian Armed Forces provide assets to perform various peace support operations under the United Nations or regional organization. This venture adapt a different CIMIC framework dictated by UN Department of Peacekeeping Operation. Additionally, the Malaysian Armed Forces has also deployed its asset to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief during calamities that have struck neighboring countries such as Indonesia, Philippines, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and many more. Ladies and gentlemen, to face the expanding spectrum, the National Security Council has formulated the National Security Policy with the aim of redefining national security and establishing the whole of government and whole of society approaches in tackling the traditional and non-traditional security challenges. The key takeaway of the National Security Policy have been translated into the Defence White Paper and hence on the National Military Strategy. Thus, this National Military Strategy has become the direction for the Malaysian Armed Forces in tackling traditional and non-traditional security challenges. These guidelines and processes afford the basis to review our doctrine and enhance our capacity to assist civil authorities effectively and efficiently. Undoubtedly, the advent of traditional and non-traditional security challenges bring with it the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity never seen before. The increase of non-kinetic threat from humanitarian crisis and natural disaster, transborder crime, human trafficking, and extremism would render the country unstable and society vulnerable to these challenges. Far more ominous is the emergence of hybrid warfare, which to exploit national vulnerabilities in the area of politics, military, economy, social, informational, and infrastructure. It decimates whole of government and whole of society architecture. Certainly, it seeks to also paralyze CIMIC, which will leave society endangered. Following the event in Ukraine today, the application of hybrid warfare as a game changer in conflicts is obvious. The Malaysian Armed Forces has embraced the principle of civilian control over the military since its inception. The successes in confronting the various non-traditional security threats could be attributed to a dynamic, holistic, and well-tested CIMIC framework performed by professional and competent personnel. Our triumph has earned the respect of the people and provided a firm platform in building confidence among the population. The perils of living on past laurels could be fatal. In this sense, the numerous conflict experience and the merits of disasters inflicted globally today with millions of victims and unthinkable destruction prove yet again that non-traditional security threats and national emergencies are complex and dynamic. The armed forces being a key cogwheel in the government vast machinery will continuously be called upon during these calamities. The problem herein lies whether we are competent and prepared to face contemporary threats and disasters, which will be far intricate in the future. Issues that might hinder the effectiveness of CIMIC would be a fine balance need to be achieved to ensure that the Malaysian Armed Forces maintain its priority on its primary tasks. The Malaysian Armed Forces must continue to employ experts and specialists in CIMIC vis-a-vis advance in modern security threat. The Malaysian Armed Forces must not only be prepared to provide CIMIC domestically, but also in out-of-area deployment. The conduct of inter-agency, bilateral and multilateral exercises must be enhanced to develop holistic competencies. The National Security Council would need to remain vigilant on the red flags raised in politics, military, economy, social, informational, and infrastructural challenges to ascertain whether hybrid warfare is waged against the country. It is fortunate that the government, through the National Security Council, has acknowledged this concern and have addressed them exponentially. That said, with modern non-traditional security challenges increasing in complexity and diversity, continuous relook on the Malaysian Armed Forces CIMIC modus operandi will be critical. To conclude, the dynamic of the new security realities advance at breakneck speed. Therefore, it is vital to be continuously vigilant and aware. Similarly, the armed forces, specifically the Malaysian Armed Forces, must maintain an effective and efficient mechanism to avoid a high degree of adaptability in its man, machine, method, and mates quadrant to face the ever-changing nature of new security challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri General, for the presentation. I would like to remind everyone that we will be taking questions at the end of the presentations. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite General Rudzani Maphwanya, Chief of the South African National Defence Force.
To Madam Coordinator and to Honorable General Tan Sri Dato Sri Haji Affendi, Excellencies, senior officials, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Mine is a complimentary presentation or a paper that supplements what Chief of the Defence Force of Malaysia said in terms of the evolution of civil-military cooperation from the perspective of the African and the Southern African region, and in particular South Africa post-1994, in pursuing defense commitments whilst winning the hearts and minds of citizens by humanitarian and other means. As security operatives, we are constantly confronted by the need to reassess and understand the current ways of securing our national, regional, and global peace. We had been more concerned and worried about an overtly reticent military leadership whose professional expertise was muffled by civilians who allegedly micromanaged military plans and operations. This was a perception held by many of security functionaries in the area of declining defense budgets. Call von Clausewitz recognized the same phenomenon. He wrote that the most senior military officers required a thorough grasp of national policy, and without losing sight of their professional role as generals, they had to become statesmen. While Samuel Huntington's book on the soldier and the state suggested that the optimum division of labor is for civilians to make policy and for the admirals and generals to give military advice, avoid politics, and in return be accorded professional space in the conduct of tactical and operational affairs. Indeed, the military is a distinct profession with its own areas of expertise. But today, the military is faced with multidimensional nature of contemporary threats and the need for diverse, multi-pronged, and yet coordinated and integrative responses by various stakeholders. All of the government and society approach will require that the leaders of the armed forces must know their space. They must be scrupulously non-partisan in word and in action. This in itself can be a characteristic of a nation in arms, in that the civilian institutions are more powerful than the military ones. The paper that I'm delivering is based on the South African context of military-civil or civil-military relations and how the South African military addresses the crucial necessity to foster a working relationship with civilians and other non-military stakeholders to build a responsive national defense force that accounts to the citizenry. It is hoped that this paper would lead to an enhanced awareness of civil-military relations in the southern region of Africa and in the South African context, and allow for countries in different regions to foster a collaborative approach in global security. Now, what is it that we perceive down south as to civil-military relations? A large number of debates on civil-military relations has been dominated by concepts of civilian control over the military, largely defined in terms of the maintenance of the supremacy of civilian office bearers in the national political decision-making process. Civil-military relations as a concept highlights the existence of civilian governments, extensive military setup, and an active and informed civil society. Let me also borrow from Samuel Huntington, who defines civil-military relations, I quote, as military security policy, which together with internal and situational security policies, is an aspect of national security policy functioning at both the operational and institutional levels, close quote. Ngoma added his voice in this approach when he said that at the very core of civil-military relations is the issue of the control and regulation of the armed and security forces by larger society, based on the principle of transparency and accountability. The objective is to have the armed and security forces which are effective and efficient. This again was captured succinctly by Adelaide Ebom, who in his article in the Civil-Military Relations says that it refers to the web of relations between the military and the society within which it operates and of which it is necessarily a part thereof. Such relations encompass all aspects of the role of the military as professional, political, social, and economic institution in the entire gambit of national life. Whereas Rocky Williams has in the meantime hinted that ultimately it may be more appropriate in many developing countries to speak either of civilian-military relations or even civil security relations, rather than simply focusing on civil-military relations in the narrower institutional sense of the word. The United Nations also pay more focus, not only on civil-military relations, but on civil-military coordination. The definition of the United Nations humanitarian civil-military coordination is the essential dialogue and interaction between civilian and military actors in humanitarian emergencies that is necessary to protect and promote humanitarian principles, avoiding competition and minimizing inconsistencies. In this way, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations definition of military coordination goes thus. In United Nations civil-military coordination is the system of interaction involving exchange of information, negotiation, the deconfliction, mutual support and planning at all levels between military elements and humanitarian organizations, development organization and the local civilian population to achieve the United Nations objectives. In the United Nations humanitarian context, coordination covers both the spectrum of potential relationships that ranges from coexistence to cooperation. Cooperation is understood as the relationship where the component partners synchronize their policies and behavior and undertake joint action, whereas coexistence, on the other hand, refers to the minimum level of coordination necessary to deconflict respective actions. Related to the United Nations civil-military coordination is the concept of inter-agency coordination and collaboration that refers to the art and act of promoting active working relationships amongst multiple security agencies with a view of improving processes outcomes at the reduced cost. Ladies and gentlemen, there are some scholars that attempted to come up with what is it that we refer to civil-military relations in South Africa. The opening remark had been always focused on what used to happen previously in Africa. The coup phenomena became a defining feature of the African political landscape very shortly following independence in the late 1950s and the early 60s. And the relationship between political leadership, military, and society is always complex and is not very harmonious. The immediate post-colonial period in most African states featured military institutions which were virtually cloned of their colonial masters and thus remained within the confines of their constitutional roles. A fundamental feature of the pattern of civil-military relations in most of Africa had always been a historical trading of places between military and the civilian population, rather than being under the control of civilians as constitutionally required. The military often took control of not only the civilian population, but the entire machinery of the state. Let me just also borrow again from what Professor Lindsay Henken from the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Stellenbosch University said. The widening civil-military gap, a knowledge gap, which speaks to the decline in understanding, decline in experience, decline in informed decision-making, and interest in military by those who should play an active role in civil cooperation. On the other hand, the culture gap was defined in the context of different cultural and norms and the balancing of military needs and core values of society that affected the functioning of the defense force. Now, civil-military relations in South Africa in the advent of democracy, that is post-1994. South Africa during the apartheid period pursued a Praetorian model wherein the military was successful in getting resources required to fulfill its mandate, and they were a power unto themselves. When the Republic of South Africa gained independence in 1994 and unbound itself from the shackles of apartheid, we were faced with mammoth task to redefine our defense posture and make the military responsive to the inclusive mandate to defend a people united in their diversity. South Africa had to move away from military that only catered for and was centered on exclusively defending white people to a national defense force that actively sought to regain the trust of the formerly oppressed African majority, whilst also not alienating their white counterparts. The country had to unite and integrate 7 formerly opposing statutory and non-statutory forces into a united national defense force that has come to be called the South African National Defense Force. As a country, South Africa adopted in alignment to the Constitution, Defense Review, White Paper on Defense, the Defense Act, a posture that was cognizant of ours being a military in defense of our democracy, subordinate to civilian control, staffed by the people, for the people, and the general good of the citizens. What we came up with is a rigorous process that ensures that as the military carries its mandate, it does so with a collaborative effort from the citizens on whose behalf our soldiers carry arms, starting from force composition of the South African National Defense Force, which was dictated to by consultative engagements with all stakeholders active during our country's transitional period. In the lead up to the birth of democracy in South Africa, it had become apparent that constitutional and legislative change in the new National Defense Force would be effected through a robust and inclusive civil-military relations. Various mechanisms exist for the exercising democratic control of the armed forces and security forces. Such mechanisms include, but are not limited to, parliamentary oversight. The South African Constitution made provision for the creation of the Defense Force with executive authority vested in the office of the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, who exercises his or her authority as empowered by the President and the Commander-in-Chief. The Constitution, as the supreme law of the country, set up parameters for legislative oversight provided by the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Defense and the Portfolio Committee on Defense and Military Veterans, as well as the Defense Act 42 of 2002 as amended. This military command was exercised through the Ministry of Defense and Military Veterans under the direction of the President. And the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans is accountable to Parliament and the Cabinet for the work and programs of the Defense Force as the department's executive authority. The same posture is also employed in operations other than war, wherein our soldiers render support and humanitarian services to citizens of South Africa, and also to Southern African Development Community and the African continent from time to time, with the restrictive defense budget allowing. Another key guideline on civil-military relations is derived from the White Paper of Defense that inculcates a culture of accountability to civilian entities. Our goal is to promote regional and continental peace and security. South Africa should enhance its strategic influence through the shaping of the multilateral security agenda, pursue critical multilateral security objectives, develop regional and continental partnerships, and participate in selected bilateral mechanisms. The South African National Defence Force would optimize its representation in multilateral security institutions and maintain a credible expeditionary capability to execute ordered commitments on the continent. Now, having looked at that, we therefore say the new security threats requires partnership. As Paul Collier, Professor of Economics and Public Policy and the Director of Center of the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford, identified general threats that predominates in the context of the African continent, where South Africa is also geographically situated. Professor Collier mentioned the rise of the radical insurgents, terrorism, violent extremism, civil instability, and conflicts resulting from discovery of natural resources, socio-economic inequalities, cyber warfare, and abject poverty as some of the most salient issues niggling the continent. There are needs, therefore, to have an approach for these softer issues and detailed, comprehensive, human-centric approach that employs civil military operations to get to the bottom of what causes conflict, enlisting the support of civilian stakeholders and other role players. And those are shift from physical to comprehensive security and hence multidimensional peacekeeping. Challenges to national security have expanded significantly to include unconventional threats. And therefore, these new threats requires us to have a different approach rather than follow the old traditional way of engaging in our security structure. Strategy should be developed to plan and execute missions, providing resources that those activities requires and continued sharing of intelligence and information. There are several interventions to address security challenges, which are inclusive of interagency coordination, collaboration. There is absolutely no doubt that civil-military cooperation is the force multiplier and enables military operations to add a vital dimension to threat elimination and conflict resolution. But there is always a danger lingering that has to do with how the military should handle non-military affairs. Allow me to touch on few of these intervention measures. There is a requirement to develop and implement overarching strategies, in particular, a strategy defining organizational roles and responsibilities and coordination mechanism in the civil-military environment. The need to create collaborative organizations that cuts across regions. The need to develop a well-trained workforce within the national and international sphere. Share and integrate national security information across all agencies. National interdepartmental coordination, as well as regional ownership and concrete actions in the capacity building. In conclusion, in South Africa, in the South African context, civil-military cooperation started as a vital element in the quest to further develop our democracy during the early days following independence and continues in that vein. Uppermost is the need to keep the military accountable to the citizens while being professional and carry its mandate with a strong sense of ethics and respect for human rights. The South African polity and its military managed over the years to accept subordination of military-civil control. This has proven to be a pinnacle against military coup d'etat and repressive rule and abuse of citizens by the military. In the final analysis, we have to deep dive and ask hard and fundamental questions as to how do we deconflict the traditional military roles from the much wider participation as defined in the human security definition. How would we respond to the contemporary threats posed by the transboundary nature of the threats? How do we foster the South-South relations in all spheres of development? What steps are agencies taking to develop joint or mutually supportive strategies to guide interagency activities? Who should be responsible for developing the shared outcomes? Ladies and gentlemen, Africa remains committed. Africa remains the bread basket that in most instances is ignored. There are, however, a number of factors to be observed in an effort to enhance civil-military relations if the world has to remain as a better place to live in. I thank you.
Thank you, General Maphwanya, and thank you for the insights into the civil-military relationship. I think this event has pretty much focused on the security issues surrounding Asia-Pacific, so it's very refreshing to also hear from your experiences in Africa. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Professor Dato Zakaria Ahmad, Vice Chancellor for Research at Help University, for his presentation.
Ms. Cynthia Ng, General Tan Sri Affendi, General Rudzani, sir. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to all of you. After a very long lunch, after a heavy lunch, sorry, and after hearing the two senior generals of Malaysia and South Africa, I'm not so sure what I'm supposed to say this afternoon. And I want to thank MIRAS and Ministry of Defense for inviting me. After accepting the invitation, I thought maybe I'd done a big mistake. Because I always thought that, when generals have spoken, right, it's very difficult to say anything else. So then I thought, but on the other hand, maybe we can learn a lot from the presentations that we made. And indeed, we have learned quite a lot. I just want to begin by giving the observation that, first of all, General Affendi gave a very good explanation about the circumstances in Malaysia and how Malaysia has evolved a very particular form of civil-military relationship which speaks well for the country. And indeed, we have been able to defeat communist insurgency because of the nature of that relationship. In the case of Africa, however, it is a much more complex situation altogether. Indeed, first of all, there are about more than 50 countries in the African continent. And South Africa presents a particular case which in some ways, right, differs from most of the other parts of Africa. And one of the things that one takes into consideration, of course, is that in South Africa, the civilian government is ascendant over the military. And so that you have a very different situation. But in many other parts of Africa, the military is ascendant over the political authority. So when we're talking about civil-military relations, right, we have to bear in mind that these are two institutions which are quite opposite of each other. And sometimes they're not able to see on the same wavelength. And indeed, and that's why in many cases, in many parts of the developing world, there have been cases of military takeovers. And largely because the civilian authorities either are unable to perform or they just don't get along with the military. And so the military at some point begins to think that because they are the more modern institution of the country, that they have to take over the running of the government. That puts us into the context of trying to understand civil-military relations and then trying to look at the new security agenda, as it were, in terms of the so-called non-traditional security threats. Since I'm a professor of strategic studies, I have to say to you that this attention to non-traditional security only began after the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, strategic studies professors did not talk much about non-traditional security. They talk about traditional security. It's about the nature of the defense of a country against external military threat. Now, however, we have a different situation. The militaries are enjoying, perhaps in some way one might say, a peacetime preoccupation. Either they play golf or they might be called to assist the civilian authorities. And I dare say to you that when the military is called to assist the civilian authorities, something is very wrong in that country, because it means that the civilian administration is unable to function well, and therefore you need to seek the help of the military. Now the military, you look at any military, most militaries are very well organized. They are actually the purveyors of modernization in many parts of the developing world. So when we look at the military, we find that their preoccupation is about their core business. What is the core business of the military? The core business of the military is to destroy the adversary, if that adversary wishes to attack the particular country of that military. That's what the job is. Now, all of a sudden, because of the so-called new security environment, we find there are a lot of crises that take place because of the inability of civilian governments to respond, and therefore the military is called upon. General Affendi may correct me, but I think the military is ill-prepared to do this. You know, the job of the military is to kill people. Now, if you are asked to assist in humanitarian missions, your job is to save people. We have to learn how to, shall we say, sheath a sword, rather than unsheath the sword to fight the enemy. So now, does it mean that the military now has to be retrained, perhaps retooled, to meet the contingencies of the new security era? I think it's a challenge that we have to think. I think, if I may say so, Sir Tan Sri, in Malaysia, I think we're trying to do that, because in this context of the professional military education, we're trying to expand the horizons of the officer corps so that they're able to then understand the complexities of modern governments and also about the kind of exigencies that they need to prepare for. This requires the need for the military to be, as I said, retooled to learn about many other things, to learn about management, to learn about the nature of societies, to understand the dynamics of leadership, and many other kinds of these issues. And of course, we have been trying to do this because we've been trying to educate the officer corps with the kind of training so that they begin to understand what has been the nature of big power rivalry, what is the consequences when countries modernize, and so on and so forth. And of course, to learn the basic tools of the basic understanding, to know the basic understanding of warfare itself. And warfare itself is becoming complicated. General Affendi, this is the second time I've heard you talk about hybrid warfare, sir. This hybrid warfare too, right, is quite complex because it requires an understanding of the conventional nature of warfare with the inclusion of the other kinds of warfare that militaries are not accustomed to. And so therefore we have to respond to that. So while we're doing this, suddenly all over the world, there have been a lot of natural crises that have taken place. Even in Malaysia, when we had the flooding recently, this was something that was not altogether, understood. And the government of the day, for whatever reason they say, was unable to take action on it. And in the end, the military had to be called in. So it requires maybe some kind of strategic rethinking. I'm not sure. Maybe the Ministry of Defense has got to do that, or maybe the government has got to do that. But to do that, we also need to train the politicians so that they understand that politics is not about making money, you know what I mean? Politics is about running the government and making sure governance works. This is a serious issue in my mind. But when you look all over Southeast Asia, I would say that the militaries have a role which is in context with the society that they have. If we go to Singapore, the Singapore military is very clearly part of the government structure. So much so that the elite of the Singapore Armed Forces, right, they retire early, then they are reposted to many civilian positions. And so they help to run the country. And normally they're very well trained. Many of them are graduates of the top universities of the world. So the Singapore government has got some kind of a, shall we say, philosophy or master plan, right? This is how they want to run the country. Then you go to the case of Myanmar. And then in Myanmar, you find that in Myanmar, the military has taken over the government. And largely because of the ineptitude of the civilian government that they had before. So to me, right, I mean, that's a good rationale why the military must take over. And the military, of course, is the well-trained, the better-trained part of the society that you have in Myanmar. And so you can find those kind of comparisons that you can make all over Southeast Asia. In Africa, however, I think it is much more difficult to know about it. And so I'm sorry because I've only been to South Africa and to Zambia. I've not been able to understand the complexities of the nature of civil-military relations in all over the African continent. And I'm not sure what kind of training, but we have been lucky in Malaysia that we've been able to train some of the officers from Nigeria, for example, in our defense college. So this is the kind of thing that we need to reformulate. In the Western notion of the role of militaries, the military is supposed to be apolitical. Apolitical means they cannot take part in politics. They should remain neutral. But when you find in a society the government is unable to function, much more worse, the government is fractured. There's no leadership in the government. Then what happens? But the military, if they train in the Western tradition, they know that they mustn't take over. And indeed, we know from empirical experience, when militaries take over, normally that means disaster. And only in maybe, I would say, in the case of South Korea, you know, where the government has been able, when the military took over the government, they were able, first of all, to bring about modernization of the economy of South Korea. And then, as it were, maybe perhaps fortuitously, they were able to transfer that power back to the civilians so that you have a democratic form of governance in South Korea. But in the case of Pakistan, I'm sorry to say, you know, the military is not around in South Africa, in Pakistan. I think Pakistan may have to be called a failed state. In some ways already people call it a failed state. But the military is the savior of Pakistan. You know? So you can look at it in that manner. Then you ask the question, so what's the role then of the military when they need to respond to the new security realities? I'm not so sure. But of course, the military has got the resources, I may say. So when we look at the 2004 tsunami that took place in Indonesia and spread all over the Indian Ocean, we find that militaries responded with the kind of efforts that saved these countries or able to salvage these countries in many ways. But to have these resources, this means that countries must equip the militaries with the kind of equipment and the manpower that's needed to do that. This, I think I will say that, yeah, I will say that militaries have not done so. And maybe they're waiting for the politicians to make that decision for them. But perhaps there's an area that perhaps we can study, sir, in this capacity. No? And to do this, of course, as I said, you need the equipment, you need the capacity, and you need the manpower. This capacity, of course, is limited because, after all, the military is trained to fight wars. And even in the fighting of wars, you find that some militaries are insufficiently equipped. In the case of Malaysia, sir, if you don't mind my saying so, and to all my senior officers here, there's not enough money. The money is there, but the money is going somewhere else. So we have this problem that we have to deal with. So it's easy to say we need to adapt to new security realities. But when we go on the ground, it's an altogether different kind of situation, because it requires, I think, some kind of wisdom, political wisdom, that should exist in the leadership of a country that can know, therefore, how to galvanize the society into the directions that can build the society to reach the level that we desire. So this is the thing that we need to do. I brought a lot of points when I came to the food roster, but I decided that perhaps the best way to look at this is to open the discussion by maybe giving these thoughts that I have so that we can have a much better discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dato Zakaria, for that very astute observation on the realities of the civil-military relationship, particularly in Malaysia. And I will now open the Q&A session. After hearing what Professor Dato Zakaria has to say, I believe perhaps there are people in the audience who would like to ask questions, refute even some of his points. But I must say that, one question that was posed for this session is, at present, there is no universal standard to differentiate military and civilian roles. That was the question posed. Now, I'm going to say this: should there be a universal standard? As Prof. Dato pointed out, each country has its own unique relationship with its military, can be complex. And within ASEAN, even if you look at Malaysia and Singapore, Tan Sri, I think the demarcation between civil and military affairs are very clear. But at the same time, some of us have the history of military rule. So what is the relationship that speaks well for respective countries? Should it be left to the country? So I'm gonna throw this question before I get to your question, because I get to ask first. So perhaps, Tan Sri, what are your thoughts about that? Should there be a universal standard when it comes to differentiating civil-military?
Thank you, Cynthia. Well, before I answer the question, first we have to look at the evolve of the military itself in certain countries. Of course, the ecosystem will be different from each country. So the way how the public and also the military in that country see things within their own context will be different. So that's why the practices, the governance, and also the standard set by the public and the military of that country will be slightly different compared to the rest. So I would say that if you're asking whether the question is whether we should have that standard definition of what it is between a military and a civilian, I think that we will let it flow by itself. To a certain extent, it will evolve by itself, and in the context of each country, they have their own belief about what they should be. So the standard by itself is set by the people themselves. Yeah.
General?
Thank you. There is an effort from the multilateral organs like the UN to try and respond to such a question, to say we cannot allow each country to have its own way of doing things. And hence, the concept of civil-military coordination within the United Nations, because this principle was articulated by the UN. And again, from the African perspective, the AU in Lome came up with a pronouncement to say, how do we standardize civil-military relations in areas where power is taken by the security establishment and undermining civil authority. So the need to standardize, therefore, is not individual countries' wish, but it is a global and a regional requirement for us to find a model that addresses the challenges of civil-military relations, specifically in defining as to what that relationship should be. The example that had been raised by the professor was that there is no one-size-fits-all at the current moment where it comes to the African approach to civil-military relations. We have heard of the coups in Mali. We have heard of conflicts taking place in various countries and the requirement for the peacekeeping effort. But the approach to such peacekeeping effort, if not governed by a particular way of handling the civilians and delineating the role of the military whilst providing the humanitarian aid, then we find ourselves now, we will be found wanting. I think in support of what CDF said, we cannot but not look at finding a solution for standardization. That is critical. And whereas civil-military relation in most of our entities is an over and above function that is not budgeted and funded. And that is what we need to impress. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Dato.
I think the universalistic criteria is the desideratum, okay? But the question is the adaptation of that model, right, to specific situations becomes quite difficult. I think this is what General Rudzani is also referring to. And of course, different countries or different regions will have different ways of looking at it. I'm reminded of Mao Zedong when he said that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, but it's the party that must control the gun. But this kind of a conceptualization, right, applies to maybe what were the former Soviet Union and its allies, and of course in China, which I think still follows this particular model. But in other countries, it's quite different because the idea is that the military must remain as an autonomous institution with its own professional ethos, which must have the understanding that its role is a professional one, which is the defense of the country. And the civilian government is only the one that governs the military, but not in the way that controls the gun. So it's quite a different consideration. But again, to reach that particular ideal, right, which is in some ways a Western ideal, is difficult to do. General Rudzani made mention about the United Nations and how it wants to handle all these peacekeeping operations that we have all over the world and what kind of standards must be applied. Again, one needs to see and assess what has been the extent of that particular approach and whether it's been successful or it's not been that successful. I would say that actually it's not been that successful.
Thank you for your response. I would like to get questions from the audience. Is there anyone who would like to throw a question to our panelists? Yes, we have, sir.
Assalamualaikum, Tan Sri. It's hard to resist when the topic is about the research topic that I'm doing at the moment. So last year there was an article written on U.S. civil-military relationship. The author, Peter Fever, says, civil-military relationship is about stormy but durable marriage. That's what he says. And he says friction in civil-military relationship is good. And to ensure that civilian always has control over the military, what we have to do is to strengthen the civilian, not to weaken the military. What is your thought in that, Tan Sri?
Wow. Well, this question of another philosophical approach of telling people saying that, you know, in one way, the civilian need to be there and the military have to be there, but not as high as a civilian. I think in the layman's word, that is what you're trying to say here. Well, in this context, I would say that let us talk about how we are as a Malaysian, been all this while looking at the function of the military and its power bestowed upon them, and also the politicians which hold the power of the government. Yeah. As we move from where we were before, and let us look at the context of post-independent, where the country is highly being threatened by the threat of the day, which is the communist insurgency, which also contribute to the turmoil of the social system, which to an extent where we can see that the government is going to go another way. So from there, we see that the function of the security element or the security forces at that point of time is highly appreciable, meaning to say that we are the one who make sure the system are intact. And as we move from there, you know, now from that point of time, we can see that, I just put in another context, at that point of time, we can see that the military are getting most of the things that they want. Why? Because they know that we are the one who keep things in place. Most of the major purchases at that time, although our GDP was quite low at that time, but we are getting more than what we are asking for. And just from that context alone, where we see today, where are we? Yeah, as a military, in terms of you're talking about the budget allocations, we are almost far from what we used to have. So from there, we know that we are always been kept at bay depending on the situation where we are now, in terms of our function, in terms of our relevancy, in terms of whether the country are in need of us, and at the point of where to keep them in power. So this is my personal thought about this, to say that what you have mentioned, again, I think this is rightly been in place in a Malaysian context. So I believe so that, you know, we have to change our approach. At this point of time, we must look at the realities of our security environment. We cannot afford to be reactive. We have to be proactive. We have to look at where we are today. We have to move as the plan and looking forward of our security challenges. We can't afford to move and to live and according to what we see now. I mean, we are, if you ask me, we are more or less living in the thinking cap of we are very comfortable, although we know that, you know, what is happening regionally, yeah, on regard to security threat, where we have to act more than what we're supposed to be. But this is the reality of things now. So you ask me now, and where we should be, we should move. We should be doing the way, how we should, react to the reality of the security threat now. Therefore, between the civilian and the military, that is where we should gauge ourselves, yeah, putting things into the right context. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
Thank you. I just want to concur with what CDF had said in terms of trying to address the complexity of the challenges that the military faces today. There are quite a number of military critics that comes out recently and say, why should the military continue to undertake civilian tasks, whereas the budget remains where it is, geared purely for us to be able to continue to wage war. The contemporary challenges demands that we should be in the forefront, and therefore the cutting of the cake should also be redefined in such a way that we should find that our war-fighting capability is not reduced by our involvement in collateral activities that are secondary to the military function of waging war. As such, we are simply saying that we are the most organized entity. Hence, when there are challenges, even if those challenges are not military in nature, the military is approached to go and assist. I will cite the recent example when the world couldn't have answers to the pandemic. The people that were in the forefront was the military. And we supported our communities. And in that way, you find that even when they are faced with natural calamities, other than disaster management agencies, the military is much more organized to respond to emergencies. So, what is important is not for the military capability to be reduced, but to have a paradigm shift, both from the political point of view in terms of the funding model and the dividing of the national cake in terms of allocation of resources. So, yes, indeed, we will continue to be involved. We will continue doing so even when we are not resourced optimally to carry out such functions. I just wanted to add that
Sure.
dimension. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I'm Commander Ridwan, Royal Malaysian Navy from the Defence College. Thank you, Tan Sri and the distinguished fellow for the insight and fruitful presentation. In most countries, national disaster management organizations are civilian-led, but include the military in their governance and planning, and rely on this force when civilian capacity is insufficient to respond. Both civil military are expected to engage in preparedness activities to improve their response and recovery capacity, but their involvement in disaster risk reduction is much less clear. As stated by Prof. Dato, Dr. Zakaria, I quote, "Before military take over the government and become disaster," unquote, what can be done by military to assist civilian-led organization to facilitate future response for disaster risk reduction in order to be vigilant and aware? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think his question is, well, how can we be more prepared, and what is the role of the military in responding even before the call for help comes from the civilian government? Tan Sri, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, we have gone through this many times. If you look back, we're talking about when we experience a major natural disaster where the military has to come in. From time to time, the situation is that I just quote you the flood disaster relief. operation. We know that by the end of, by year end, we always, we're going to face the flood anyway, especially in the East Coast. And as far as the military is concerned, that is become our regular operation. Yeah, we put our personnel on standby. We put our asset that's required for the flood relief operation to be in place. Yeah, it depends on how serious it is. Most of the time, we will be able to conduct the operation successfully. Well, now the template of the operation has changed. At one time, just looking at example, last year when we have urban flood, yeah, where the shift of the way how this operation be conducted has changed, and more or less a very concentrated area where the number densely populated, where the number of population compared to the rural areas are different, and the flood came within hours rather than within days. So therefore, not only the disaster management department are unable to cope. In fact, we also take time for us to cope and provide the required assistance. This is the reason because we are far away. We are not been prepared in those areas. And the other thing is that the nature of urban flood is completely different from the rural flood. Yeah, and to look at this, looking at how should we be prepared. Now we have to change the way how we put things in operation now. In fact, this year we had put in additional critical issue that we need to address, which is looking into the major disaster relief operation. Not only because of this flood, the function of the military during the pandemic situation itself have shown, have proven that we need to come in, and then in order for us to assist and to make sure, ensure success, we have to be prepared with the right tools. So this right tool have to be planned, have to be purchased. So with all these things, we really need to put this as part of our CIMIC operation or military operation other than war, and to ask the government for the real budget and to prepare ourselves for the right tools. So this, in fact, has been put into this year our operational budget, which hopefully that we will get the appropriate expenses for us to bring all these assets in place. Yeah.
Thank you, Tan Sri. I think it seems like the present environment does call for a greater involvement, integration of the military into society beyond its traditional roles of defense and security. We have come to the end of the session, but if the organizers allow me to take one more question, because there's this gentleman right at the back there who's raised his hand for a while. Final question, sorry guys.
Testing. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. I'm Captain Fairuz from Malaysian Armed Forces Defence College. I have a question for General Rudzani. First of all, thank you for sharing interesting fact about the South African perspective on civil-military relations. If you don't mind sharing, General, in a South African post-apartheid, how do you see the diversity in the South African National Defence Force work in promote or exemplify the unity and harmony within the society, as it is vital for the civil-military relation success? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. We pride ourselves in the strength in our diversity, unity in our diversity. Our society had been so much polarized, but when it comes to addressing issues of national interest, we harness our effort towards finding a common solution. It is in that line, on that note, that whenever there are disasters, I will cite an example. When Idai had hit Mozambique, we forgot about the challenges that we were facing in the country, and we dispatched our air assets to go and assist the Mozambicans. I think it is common knowledge that we delivered a baby on top of a tree and get that child to safety. The child has grown. So it is in diversity that we draw our strength. If the issue of civil-military relation has to be looked at from the context of using our collateral capabilities, yes, indeed, we might not be structured for that, but we do have contingencies that we plan in order to be able to respond. Hence, we said earlier that our view and our paradigm of understanding security is based on the issue of global vulnerabilities, whereby we are no longer planning only for those traditional threats as perceived, but on whatever posed as a threat to humanity, be it poverty, be it disaster, be it lack of education, be it lack of health. So in that case, we build contingencies so as to be able to respond to those vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's all the time that we have, unfortunately. So I would really like to thank Professor Dato, General, and Rudzani, as well as Tan-Sri General, for their insights and sharing their experiences. We will go for another break, but please stay back because we have one more session. It's quite interesting. It's about how media affects war and conflicts, particularly social media. That will be moderated by my colleague, Naila Huda. So please stay back. It's at 3:50 p.m. So we will see you shortly.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for our moderator and speakers. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our session will adjourn for a tea break and it will continue at 15:30. See everybody again shortly. Thank you.